Welcome to the Mental Disorder Podcast. My guest today is Caleb Ontiveros. Caleb is a computer programmer with a background in philosophy. He is the founder of Stoa, an app that combines the ancient philosophy of Stoicism with mindfulness and meditation. He writes the Stoa Letter, co-hosts the podcast Stoa Conversations, and is the editor of the Classical Futurist Substack. Caleb, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks so much for having me on.
Your background is very interesting because you go from studying philosophy to the tech world and then sort of a combination of the two. But I want to start by asking you what got you interested in philosophy and then Stoicism in particular, because most people who study philosophy, they might kind of go past the Stoics, but there's actually not that many people who stop there.
I'll start in the beginning. So I got interested in philosophy because I wanted to know whether God existed or not. So I was very excited about these sort of religious debates when I was in high school and stumbled across philosophy that way. Because of course, that's just such a essential philosophical matter, really. And I was interested in that question because whether or not God exists plays an important role in how one should live one's life. You know, I grew up as a Christian, and of course, Christianity is a philosophy of life in the sense that it tells you what the good life is and how to get it. And Stoicism is more or less the same in that sense. It's also a philosophy of life without being a religion. And as far as Stoicism goes, I studied philosophy in undergrad, went to graduate school for a bit. And it is interesting that you bring up the issue of, you know, who's interested in Stoicism. There's a growing resurgence of academics who are interested in the Stoics, but throughout my, academic philosophical career, I did not read that much of the Stoics. When I was an undergrad, the ancient philosophy class had a single day essentially on Stoicism, and it didn't stick out to me then when I encountered it. It wasn't until later that I saw sort of like the value of Stoicism as a practical philosophy of life. So, and that came through actually reading Nassim Taleb and his book Anti-Fragile. He cites Seneca, a famous Roman philosopher, statesman, and playwright. And from there, I read a little bit of Seneca, read some of Marcus Aurelius, the Stoic Roman emperor, and it was clear to me that Stoicism was something that was of a lot of value.
Well, for people who are unfamiliar with Stoicism, can you give sort of a brief outline of, who the Stoics were and what they believe? From my understanding of Stoicism, when most people talk about it like casually, they just think that's just be tough, right? Being Stoic just means like, don't talk about your problem, just kind of grin and bear it. And but obviously the tradition is, different than that. It's richer than that. So just can you give a brief sort of definition?
Yeah, so Stoicism is a Greco-Roman philosophy. It is a philosophy of life. So it's an account of what a good life is and how to achieve it to the best of one's ability. And they were laser focused on sort of like the life of virtue, or another phrase they might use as living in accord with nature. And what that means is that for them, the virtue was necessary and sufficient for a good life. So long as you have a good character, you are living well. Good decisions and judgments are fundamentally what matters. That is what's up to us, and it's by controlling our judgments and making excellent decisions that we shape who we are. And then of course they offered techniques and practices for doing that. And in terms of who they were, there's a wide range of people, from the Stoic emperor, Marcus Aurelius, and to say Epictetus, a teacher of Stoicism who was initially a slave. His name literally means acquired. So those are some of the Roman Stoics, and of course Seneca, who I mentioned already. So the school emerged in Greece, got transported into Rome, and it has this real practical focus in addition to some of these, more theoretical ideas about what virtue is, a particular philosophy of mind, Stoic psychology. but ultimately it's geared on action.
Mm. And at the time, did these people consciously identify as being part of a group called the Stoics, or was that later placed upon them?
Oh yeah. So the term Stoicism comes from the word Stoa, which essentially just means port. It's where the Stoics would meet, and over time that term caught on. But by the time you get to the Roman Stoics, they would consciously identify as Stoics. There's really a competitive environment of philosophical schools in Greece to Rome, competing over students or competing over cultural influence. And so by you get to the point where you have a school that's established. There's a fellow named Zeno. He founds it. He's the head of the school. And then he has followers, Cleanthes, second head of the school, Chrysippus. And these people are, form a proper lineage. They're identified as Stoics. Where you look back on other philosophical schools, like say existentialism, carving out exactly who an existentialist is say less straightforward than looking at, who the Stoics were.
Now, in terms of competition, right, in ancient Greece and Rome for sort of, philosophy students, the main groups are, you've got the Stoics, you've got the Epicureans. Who else are the sort of major players on the scene at that time?
We'd have Aristotelians or Peripatetics followers of Aristotle. There's another school called the Cynics, which heavily influenced the Stoics, but they were a rival school, or really they're closer to a collection of philosophers than an established school. In addition to skeptics, different forms of skeptics. These philosophical schools would differ to greater or larger degrees. So if you take the Epicureans, in a sense, the Epicureans would be the classical Stoic rivals, because they held that pleasure was the ultimate good. Whereas the Stoics held that pleasure is really something that's indifferent. It's preferable, but in and of itself, it's not fundamentally good. So that's a sort of thing that they might argue over. Although at the same time, these schools would emphasize things like virtue, different views of what nature was, to the extent that many modern groups don't. So Nassim Taleb doesn't think there's a substantial difference in practice between the Epicureans and the Stoics, which is debatable, but it's at least true insofar as both of them are focused on virtue in a way that many modern people who have some, they might be more nihilistic and they might not have an account of values, don't, or if they do have an account of values, it's going to be probably closer to something that is utilitarian or maybe more rules-based.
So you used the term earlier, life philosophy, which I think is an interesting term, right? Because there's always a question of what's between sort of philosophy and religion, right? And I think to some degree, maybe in the West, we're used to religion because of monotheism being this very kind of strong, all-encompassing belief system, whereas, more in the East, it's like, is Taoism a religion, or is it a life philosophy? Is Buddhism a religion or life philosophy? It's not necessarily one or the other. It's sort of like in the middle, right? But it's interesting, right, that the people at that time, they believed, or I don't know if they believed consciously, but they seem to understand that in order to have a good account of what you should do, you have to have a good account of nature, you have to have a good account of the mind, right? And so they had all these different debates around all of these subjects, and it's not, quite like today where everything seems more, you can sort of pick and choose. But there was sort of an acknowledgement that, like, your view of what the most important, good in life was should then affect your views on action and the mind, and all these things are sort of related. Is that sort of a fair reading of, how they would have viewed these disagreements?
Yeah, I think they all had different views on, say, different domains of physics, which we could, broadly understand as nature, maybe more empirical issues, the domain of logic, and then of course ethics as well. And all of these schools would be coming up with comprehensive accounts of each of these. And so you get particular views of nature from the Epicureans. They think things are atomized, it's particles bouncing around in a void, and so on. Whereas the Stoics see nature as ordered, as having a providential aspect. And those, at the very least, influence how they see the other fields of logic and ethics. So things are certainly tightly bound in that way, and probably that would have been clearer to many of the ancient practitioners of philosophy. Whereas, arguably today, those things, still should influence what one believes about the world. Right, one's account of nature should influence what you think the good life is. That seems correct, but perhaps the connections are going to be less clear.
Yeah, like I think a lot of people, they wouldn't base their view of physics necessarily as relates to their view about ethics, right? Although in some sense you do see a lineup, right? So you see sort of, I don't know, almost more empiricist people who are everything is scientific, and they tend to have a more utilitarian kind of ethic, and then more rationalist. I don't mean like the term the way people use it now, where rationalist means what empiricism meant yesterday, but rationalist in the sense of everything is sort of, providentially decided and created, and it's ordered, and you have to have right? Everything's about rules, basically. So it's interesting how those kinds of, things stack up. Now, Stoics believed that virtue was the most important, sort of thing in life, as the almost animating force of what you should aspire to in life. What was the basis of their belief that virtue should trump pleasure, or should trump, I don't know, I guess a state of just sort of tranquility where you don't really try too hard? What brought them to virtue?
One of the key arguments for that is just that virtue is always beneficial. So if you think of the arrival account that holds that, say, pleasure's, not to beat on the Epicureans too much, but pleasure is what matters. You can think about particular cases in which pleasure arguably is not beneficial. The pleasure of the sadist, is that something that is intrinsically good or not? My sense is that it's not valuable at all. You can have thought experiments where, if utilitarians often like to think in this way. You have one world with these attributes versus some other world with these other attributes. Imagine you have this world as opposed to one other world where some terrible person has slightly more pleasure. Is that the better world? Probably not. And I think this is likely true for essentially all sort of outcome-oriented goods. One might posit as the final good. Whereas virtue, virtue is acting well. And ultimately for the Stoics, it's going to be knowledge, knowing the good and knowing how to apply it. And that is always beneficial. And that's the sort of thing that allows one to say, yes, sometimes pleasurable is, or sometimes I should say pleasure is preferable, but other times it's not valuable at all.
Right. And did they ever consider that if you define virtue as also including knowledge, it becomes harder to make this kind of argument? But did anyone ever, object and say, well, many people think they're acting virtuously. They act with virtue in doing something, but the action they're taking actually ends up, being negative. So, for example, if you have two armies at war, they might both be acting virtuously in terms of defending their homeland, defending their country. But the end result of them both acting as virtuously as possible is they all end up dead. Versus if they had both been a bit more utilitarian about it and kind of said, look, this is kind of dishonorable, but maybe we can just sort of agree to move some stuff around, then maybe everyone would have been better off. Were those kinds of arguments ever sort of levied, or is that a misunderstanding of what they meant by virtue?
I think you could have the view that the right thing to do, this utilitarian view, is going to be just essentially dominated by the outcomes. And say, I, out of no knowledge of my own, it just so happens that if I turn on this light in my room, that's going to result in some terrible disaster. Or if I do some apparently good thing, that's going to result in some other terrible disaster. These sorts of things, I think the Stoics would be fine with, saying if that's, given all that I knew, if I was behaving appropriately in my role, turning on my lights, a pretty normal thing to do. I didn't, wasn't negligent in, for whatever reason, knowing that should have caused a disaster. That sort of thing is fine, because if we have in ethics, it needs to be sort of action relevant. And I think sometimes these more utilitarian accounts are going to become divorced from action if you are expecting the right action to depend on, the sorts of facts that no one can possibly know. So there's one thing to say there, but there's another thing to say might be that, so if you take someone who, a famous Stoic from the past, a fellow named Cato the Younger, he was an opponent of Caesar and was famously principled. And that sort of comes into this issue of, if you're in politics, to what extent should you dirty your hands? To what extent should you make compromises with potential tyrants? And I think sort of a perennial debate is, what was Cato acting with virtue when he refused to compromise, or was he just being pig-headed? Was he being stubborn? Was he not acting with the flexibility that virtue requires? And perhaps that does bring out that there's going to be some amount of complexity in determining what the right thing to do is. And there are some of these questions around, especially larger social questions, that there's going to be some amount of uncertainty over what the virtuous act is. But I don't know if that's just going to show that you can have two people sort of almost in like a prisoner's dilemma type style, where they do the virtuous thing and that results in the worst world.
The political example is quite interesting, right? And if you can observe politics, and it seems sort of obvious which path most politicians take. Although every once in a while there is one politician who really sticks to their guns, and I wouldn't say often they're rewarded, but I feel like when they do succeed, everybody is more happy about that person succeeding. I also think of a case like, I know, Batman is actually a good example, right? So Batman has this rule where he doesn't kill anybody. So he lives in a city that's, overrun with criminals, many of whom have like extremely dangerous superpowers and technologies and things. And yet he refuses to kill. He will only place criminals in the prison or the asylum, which they almost always escape from. And many Batman comics and movies and things are about this, where people are saying like, well, Batman, why don't you just kill this person? Instead of having to constantly rearrest them after they've killed other people. And he always says, no, like I would never stoop to their level. And I guess people can have an honest, disagreement about which is the virtuous thing to do in those kinds of situations. And maybe we'll never have an answer, but it seems like an open question versus a lot of other situations, a lot of other cases we wouldn't really have a disagreement about.
Yeah, I think that's right.
Let's turn a bit to Stoicism and mental health. First of all, can you explain sort of the Stoic view of emotions and how emotions are integrated into their philosophy?
Yeah. So I think one of the central things for the Stoics is that emotions are downstream of our judgments. And one way to think about that is you have the sort of pain that's involved in exercise. When you're exercising, that pain is generally going to be manageable. It's going to be experienced differently than it would be if, you were walking around the grocery store and randomly felt the exact same pain And that's because of the judgments that are associated with the situation. And likewise, there are many cases we observe of people experiencing the same negative, adverse events. They respond differently. What's the best explanation for that? They have different interpretations of those events, perhaps because of their character, their past experiences, whatever it is. So that's one of the key moves the Stoics have about emotion. They have this sort of cognitive view of emotions. The founder of rational emotive behavioral therapy, Albert Ellis, has a nice line where many, I think, therapists or many patients would just come in to his office and sit down and explain their problems. And at the end, they might insist, that's just how I feel. That's just how I feel. Things they're terrible, and that's just how I feel. And he would like to point out, no, but it's also how you think. And that is, I think, one of the crucial Stoic moves that is made, is that how you think matters. Marcus Aurelius has a line: consider that everything is opinion, and opinion is in your power. Take away when you choose your opinion, and like a mariner who has doubled the promontory, you'll find calm, everything stable, and a waveless bay. And given that we have that kind of power over our opinion, that doesn't mean we can snap our fingers and fail to experience emotional pain. But given that we have that power, we can improve our judgments, see things as they are, and reduce negative emotions by seeing things, by seeing reality more clearly.
One part of Stoic philosophy tends to be this idea that there are things outside of my control, in nature, the universe, destiny, the actions of others, but there are certain things within my control, right? So most importantly, my actions, my feelings, my thoughts. How much agency do the Stoics give to people to control their own thoughts or their own emotions? Is it viewed as you have a lot of control over your own thinking, over your own feeling, or is it viewed more like those things are also sort of part of nature, out of your control, but you have an ability to act differently based on your training, in essence?
Yeah. I think if we go a little bit more into detail, and the Stoic picture of psychology might be useful. So one way to think of it is that it has there's sort of four steps to how we experience the world. One is we receive some initial impression, just some initial appearance. It appears to me there's a car in front of me. It appears to me that someone rudely bumped into me in the subway, whatever it is. So we have impression. And then the next step would be reflection. We bring to bear our past judgments, past experiences to that impression. And then the third step would be assent. Do I agree that there is a car in front of me? Do I agree whether someone rudely bumped into me in the subway? And then after that agreement, the fourth step would be impulse. That's sort of the beginning of action. So if there's a car in front of me, that might not prompt any action. If someone bumped into me in the subway, and I believe it truly was rudely, perhaps that's going to prompt me to begin to move my body, turn around, whatever it is. And that the impressions we receive are not directly up to us, right? They are a matter of what the world decides to throw our way. But reflection, assent, and determine impulse, and in that sense, impulse might be indirectly up to us, and reflection and assent are up to us in the sense that our past judgments, past assents have formed what we bring to bear on every impression. If I have past experience, if I have some belief that, when people bumping into you in the subway is normal, then I'm going to be less likely to believe that perhaps someone bumping into me was rude, this sort of thing. And then whether we disagree or not with a given impression, that also is up to us. So in that sense, some of the ancient Stoics, perhaps especially a fellow named Epictetus, thought we had an exceptional amount of agency over our world. And it's a little bit of a paradox, because in some sense he believed that this is all that is up to us is this internal rational aspect of ourselves, but we do have a significant amount of control over it. All these other downstream things, whether it's health, reputation, wealth, pleasure, we can influence those, but ultimately they're not up to us. The only things that are up to us are our ability to reflect on impressions and assent to them or not. So there's some, you can, and then you can just, I think there's some debate over just how much agency that is going to amount to. Of course, the fact that you have all these past judgments that you're always bringing whoever you are to bear on the impressions you're judging is going to constrict what you assent to or not. It's even going to influence how you interpret the impression. And the Stoics would also be happy to say that many initial feelings one experiences are not up to you at all, and many habits we build up, or either from society or from nature, are going to occur so quickly that they're going to be exceptionally difficult to reprogram, as it were. So all in all, there's some amount of room about how much agency a Stoic might think one has, but I think on the margin, they're going to be much more on the pro-agency side. I think people can, in fact, change how they experience the world. They can, at the very least, start moving in the right direction once they have corrected their errors.
Yeah, it sounds a bit, based on what you're saying here and some of the other stuff I've read from you, that part of the idea here is to correctly assign the type of thinking you're doing to the right category. So you and your co-host Michael recently did a podcast for Stoic Conversations about Daniel Kahneman's book, Thinking Fast and Slow, and its connection to Stoicism. And what I think is interesting about that idea is, in Thinking Fast and Slow, you've got System 1 and System 2 thinking. System 1 is sort of impulsive, heuristic, really fast, and System 2 is more calm, deliberated. And what I almost get the sense of is Stoicism, a lot of it is about trying to bring the things that you would normally evaluate too quickly, too heuristically, over into the System 2 camp, where you can think about them more rationally, more calmly. And at the same time, there are some things that you don't want to over-deliberate. There are some things where you actually want to trust your gut. And you obviously, through cultivating a practice, you develop your gut, your intuition. And so there are some things that you actually don't want to deliberate too much on, that you want to act, more quickly on. Something like that kind of a decent, not perfect, but decent fit to Kahneman's theory.
Yeah, I think it's a good fit. I think one way to think about Kahneman's theory is that System 1 and System 2 are different ways of generating impressions that we decide to assent to or not. So, and then the question is, so do you think those impressions were generated reliably or not? And that's just going to depend on the field. So one's intuitions, or rather, they say System 1 beliefs about the stock market for most people are likely going to be pretty unreliable. But perhaps if they're in a physical field where you get quick feedback, whether it's climbing, soccer, what have you, that is going to be the kind of case where you don't need to over deliberate. And indeed, I think many athletic coaches often advise people to don't self-interfere with your deliberative process. You don't need to over analyze, especially when you're in the thick of performing. Maybe when you stand outside yourself, think about what can be tweaked, then you can become as analytical as you like. But often much of our learning is not going to be done in System 2. So I think that was a fun episode. And there's certainly some amount of impact, or there's certainly some amount of connection. I think some might be tempted to say what Stoicism is telling you to do is generate more impressions from System 2. And I would be wary of that being the single takeaway, just because, as you suggest, there are different styles of thinking, different styles of learning that are suitable for different activities.
Yeah, and I also think for many things, your goal in whatever you're doing should eventually be to move system two thinking back to system one in some sense. So if you are, if you are a stock trader, you eventually get so good at it that you can quickly identify, trends and whether to buy or sell. And it's not that you never go back and deliberate more, but that should be, over time you improve these things. Now, another sort of through line here to psychology is the cognitive behavioral therapy angle. And so earlier you were talking about, I think, Albert Ellis's therapy, which I think is then influences cognitive behavioral therapy. But many of the things you talk about in terms of, adjusting perceptions, trying not to catastrophize, trying to change your thinking, to change your emotions and actions and vice versa, the idea they're all interconnected. This is a lot of what they teach in cognitive behavioral therapy. Is there any sort of explicit connection to, Stoicism and cognitive behavioral therapy, or is it just people picking up on these good ideas and, it's one of those things that's baked into reality, that the chain is obvious?
Well, the historical connection is that I think you could think of Albert Ellis as one of the, maybe like in the first wave cognitive behavioral therapists, perhaps. And he was explicitly influenced by the Stoics, especially Epictetus and Epictetus's lines about how it's not things in themselves that harm you, but our perception of them. And that shows up in his philosophy, as well as his interactions with Aaron Beck, when they are just focused on this. Of course, you have the view of emotion that we spoke to earlier, but what's next after that view? Well, now you want to target negative thought patterns, cognitive distortions that produce these judgments that cause suffering. And many of them, whether it's unrealistic expectations, different ways of catastrophizing, are going to be line up very nicely with what the Stoics said. Another connection or technique from the Stoics is premeditatio malorum, or negative visualization, which amounts to thinking of ways things could go wrong before they in fact do. And doing that in a systematic way, which maps on to exposure therapy, which my sense is one of the most effective interventions that many modern day therapists will use, both in CBT and outside. And that both in terms of like the physical practice, expose yourself to what you are afraid of, what you fear irrationally in a systematic way. And also that mental preparation, thinking through what could in fact go wrong. Imagine it did go wrong. Would that impact my happiness? Is, I think, a clear connection. But I think also brings out what is different about Stoicism from cognitive behavioral therapy, where on one hand, say premeditatio malorum, that's good for planning. You can prepare for when things go wrong. It's good for being psychologically prepared. If things go wrong, perhaps it won't impact you as much. But the fundamental reason the Stoics advise doing that is to see that if things went wrong, that wouldn't harm you. And they have this picture of value that, virtue is happiness, right? What we chatted about in the beginning. All that fundamentally matters is you making excellent decisions and judgments. That's you, and that in the end, that's all you have control over after all. Whereas I think many cognitive behavioral therapists, they're not going to add that additional picture of value, because that's going to be much more contingent on the patient's beliefs about what's good or not.
Do you think there is, within something like cognitive behavioral therapy, an implicit set of values?
Well, I think humans are valuing creatures for it. So in nearly any activity, there's going to be some kind of implicit value at the very least. And I think that there are values, and they're probably going to be pretty different across different therapists and patients, but they likely will map onto something like living in accordance with what the patient takes to be some of their fundamental projects, their fundamental values, of course, and then also maybe realizing some shared values we all have, like reducing the negative experiences that might be occurring due to whatever mental disorder or whatever reason the patient showed up to the therapist's couch in the first place.
Yeah, my sense is that the implicit value, generally speaking, is more utilitarian, sort of hedonic kind of focus, not necessarily pleasure, but just trying to reduce suffering is the ultimate sort of value. And the, maybe ensconced within that a bit is a view of patients or people who are, practicing therapy as basically utility maximizers who, through unfortunate means, whether it's their life experience or something's gone wrong in their head, but they have a hard time, maximizing utility in ways that work or that make sense or that don't lead to other problems. So you might imagine somebody who's, sexually compulsive. So they're going out having sex with people that's bringing them joy or pleasure, but then they feel bad about that or it causes other problems. And so the balance isn't quite right. I think if you had a sex addict who walked into a therapist's office and said, I've been having sex with lots of people, but I feel fine. I feel great. There's nothing wrong with me. I don't think the therapist would say, well, that's not virtuous, right? You're not living the type of life you should be living. They would just say like, okay, you're fine, right? And that, I guess, reflects part of the difference in implicit philosophy, which is, I guess, the fact that it is actually a medical, in some sense, thing, right? It's supposed to be psychiatric, medical. You're trying to heal people versus the Stoic thing. It's not about healing you. It's about a broader philosophy of life. And yeah, so maybe that kind of is going on and explains some of the difference.
Yeah, that's interesting. I wouldn't think of the most of these relationships as utilitarian because there are other values that are, I think, at least implicitly shared that are going to trump maximizing utility, say like patient autonomy in particular, or client autonomy, where it's probably true that in some cases, the therapist is going to maybe push the patient in particular ways, but they're not going to do anything that would infringe on, or I shouldn't be so strong. Sometimes people do, in fact, infringe on their patient's autonomy, but typically they will not push anything that sacrifices these norms around patient autonomy, or say even perhaps other norms around confidentiality, even if one could expect them to promote in expected utility terms better life.
That's a good point. Maybe it's some combination in terms of values and things, and maybe the medical. I mean, I think medical ethics is its own kind of interesting question, and whether it applies well to therapy and all this stuff. But one criticism that's sometimes levied of CBT that is maybe applicable to Stoicism is that it's overly individualistic. And some people make a political connection to this and they say it's all neoliberalization, right? It used to be that there were these communities and then they got hollowed out. And now because of efficient markets, everybody's in different places doing different things. And, it's wrong to tell people that you actually are the only one who can control this, because that's not true. Your congressman is the one who can control this, right? Or if you and all your buddies you and your buddies could all be at home learning about Stoicism, being resilient on your own, or you could all get together and have a barbecue, and that would actually be better for all of you than doing their own thing. What do you make of that kind of argument about, I guess it's an argument really about self-help and self-improvement, but do you think that, Stoicism is individualistic, or does it branch off into taking higher forms of action in a way, actually, that something like CBT might not?
Stoicism certainly can be implemented in a way that is individualistic. And you can certainly find lines from the ancient Stoics or indeed modern Stoics that would support that, focusing on building resilience, meaning, not carrying what is up to you. And that might include political matters. And then is that right? Is that wrong? It's going to depend on the situation, I think. That being said, there are many resources in Stoicism to connect to much a life outside of the patient. Stoics think virtue is important. Part of being virtuous is playing your roles well, and they have a whole theory of role ethics about what that looks like. That involves recognizing the relationships you're in, both of those that you have explicitly chosen, say as a employee, but also those you are thrown into, whether that is your family or your city. And living well is going to involve not being individualistic at all. Now, is that going to satisfy the person who has this kind of objection? Maybe not, but just because I think often many Stoics still might be working at a smaller level. But there is one other thing I wanted to say here, which is that I think if the most insightful thing from this objection is that becoming more resilient isn't always the most important thing. And that I think should be obvious. And there is a certain kind of self-help venture that can look quite close to a form of narcissism. I think one of Nassim Taleb's quotes is, meditation is a good way to be narcissistic without harming anyone, or something like that. I don't agree with that, but there certainly is, the line, there should be moderation in everything. And there is a form of self-help that is not moderate and that is isolating and far too individualistic.
Yeah, well, one thing that struck me when I was doing research for this podcast is I never go on Reddit, but I went on r/Stoicism because I was just curious what people were posting. And a lot of it was people with real issues like addiction, mental health issues. And I was expecting, philosophy discussions, but a lot of these were real people who are posting in these forums, and they're basically asking for help. And they're saying I have an addiction problem. I have depression. I haven't spoken to anyone in a year, and I'm afraid to go outside. How do I get back into the social world? And people were very supportive overall, but also honest, I think, in a way you wouldn't necessarily find in other mental health communities, which I actually thought was really cool. But it does seem that people are turning to Stoicism for not just life advice generally, but also sort of for mental health reasons. And, I wanted to ask you, because you have the Stoa, or you've created the Stoa app, which I've used a couple of times for listeners who are curious. I recommend checking it out because every day there's a quote, there's some theory, there's a practice, a commitment, an action. It's a really interesting thing. I normally don't like meditation apps at all, but and I actually skip most of the meditation parts. But just in terms of the idea of a daily kind of practice one could do with, centered around a philosophy, that's very practical. I liked it a lot. And so my question is, why do you think right now people are turning to Stoicism for guidance about mental health issues? Is, because again, from the public's perception, being Stoic is almost a total reversal of that. It's not talking about your problems, not talking about your feelings. So, what's the connection? What are people missing in terms of what's happened in the last couple of years?
Yeah. I think the interest in Stoicism has certainly grown. And I think there are a wide range of reasons for this, but I think some of the central ones are that there's sort of a sister movement around mindfulness, different Western forms of Buddhism that I think some people recognize as valuable, but it doesn't exactly speak to them. Maybe it's not as Western or rational as they would like. Whereas Stoicism does have much more of a focus on rational thought, thinking through your problems, how you respond to them, identifying cognitive distortions, and so on. And that is something that many people enjoy doing. And indeed, when I stumbled across different meditation apps, the reason I created Stoa initially was just because I want something like this, but it should be Stoic, not focused on this sort of watered down version of Western Buddhism. That might, I think, is one reason. But another reason is that Stoicism shares so much of what is people have found useful in cognitive behavioral therapy, but it has these additional aspects that provide answers for what a meaningful life is, that provide an identity. I am a Stoic, that many people are missing as the secularization increases, as many of these, I think, common narratives might be breaking down. So those two aspects are some of the central ones that I would point to in terms of asking why Stoicism has risen over the past few decades.
I mean, there's been more interest in mental health overall for everyone. I think a lot of guys feel like the options out there aren't always for them and are maybe too focused on emotions and sort of not focused enough on action. Do you think there's anything there? I don't know about the gender balance of your app or something like that, but whenever I've met somebody in person and they've said I'm a Stoic, it's always a guy, and it's usually an engineer.
Yeah, I think there's certainly something to that. Stoicism has more stereotypically masculine thought patterns, I suppose. It was founded entirely by men. And I think that many Stoic groups or apps are going to have a gender skew that varies anywhere from 60% to 90% men. There are, I would say that there are some women, of course, who don't find the typical, say, mental health apps that useful, and they also maybe they have more of a analytical style, and they will also find Stoicism useful. So, and I've noticed across different newsletters, the apps, the gender balance is going to be is different. So our gender balance on Stoa, the app, is closer to equal, whereas most of our written materials are, for whatever reason, and in the podcast, for whatever reason, are much more male. And some of that might be changing. There's some work by Brittany Polat that focuses on Stoicism, and especially around people in caretaking roles, whether it's nursing, teaching, and so on. And that, I think, is going to make, as people doing those sorts of projects increase, that's going to might shift the landscape a little bit. But there's certainly something to that.
That sounds like a good use of Stoicism for those occupations. Well, it brings me to something that I think is a big question in mental health, not publicly, but maybe privately, which is, to what degree is just talking about stuff actually useful? And to what degree is just expressing emotions actually useful? There are some studies that show that, like, if you never express your emotions, that's not good. In fact, there was one of Stoicism, sort of naive Stoicism, as they called it, that showed that the people who were the least likely to talk about their feelings, or they didn't do as well as other people. At the same time, it's also true that if you tell people just don't think about your feelings, they tend to feel happier. And there is correlational evidence that shows that the people who think about their emotions less and express it less are happier. And you can sort of put that either way. But I think fundamentally, one thing we have to think about in terms of mental health and society at large is whether we want to continue to be a society that really emphasizes emotion, or one that tries to sort of restrain it a bit more. And the reason I say that is because I genuinely want people to feel better. And it seems to me that there's probably some kind of sweet spot where you feel your emotions and you maybe process them and you only express them if necessary or when it's appropriate. But I almost feel like in psychology, we've gone in the other direction to the point of being over affirmative. So I don't know, maybe Stoicism has, something closer to the sweet spot on that issue as well.
Right. I think some people hear Stoicism and they'll interpret it as, oh, you should just have the stiff upper lip, never complain, these sorts of things, which is not ultimately what Stoicism is about. Indeed, it's not even about reducing negative emotions. Fundamentally, it's about, being a good person, to the best of your ability. That being said, of course, I think that certainly over the past decade, many people have gone great lengths to distinguish Stoicism with a capital S, like this is the life philosophy versus being Stoic, where you might describe someone who has the stiff upper lip. I've gone to great lengths distinguishing these two. And there's plausibly something of value in cultures that practice this lowercase Stoicism, and Stoics, now the capital S, are going to be a little bit closer to that on average, perhaps, than many educated people who might be more, or than many people who might ingest more of these expressive modes of being. But really, I could see Stoicism being flexible about what the culture ends up being, whether we end up favoring more expression and then just ensuring that we cultivate positive emotions, that the expressions of emotions represent, that Stoics think emotions are judgments, so they need to be true, they need to be grounded in reality in some sense. As long as if we can be expressive, and if we have processes for ensuring that the judgments are good ones, that could be just as good as perhaps more restrictive cultures.
Yeah, I did a podcast. It hasn't come out yet, but with Kevin McAfee, who's a sociologist, and he's written a bit about suicide and secularization. And I was surprised when I talked to him, because I was kind of approaching him with this idea of maybe we should, have more of a stiff upper lip and not talk so much about these issues, especially if there's, a chance that they could impact other people's, maybe people will be more likely to, commit suicide or something like that. He said, no, we should have people be as open and honest as possible, as often as possible. We just need it to be the case that when they do that, they actually have mental health care people who are better than the ones we have now. So, right, like it's okay to be fully expressive if you have an action to back that up. And part of the problem is if you have a healthcare system or society where you tell everybody to be really expressive, and then you don't actually have the resources or the knowledge, the wisdom to then take that negative expression and turn it positive, then you've just sort of made everybody more miserable, but you haven't provided them with a solution.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think, so you have this meme around men should be more expressive and more emotional, but my general sense is that men are punished both by women and other men for being overexpressive in a way that women are not, and that norm has not changed merely because people have spoken about expressing your emotions more and that being good. And I think the question is, do you want to let people express themselves and then handle that appropriately, or are you going to say be a culture that puts the onus on the person to do as much work as they can? And I could see either working out well, but right now, merely doing one, or having people isolate without asking for help when they truly need it, or having them express themselves and not get the help, or worse, is certainly not ideal.
Yeah, and maybe part of this as well is a change, and some would say this is feminization. I think that's part of it. I also think part of it is just subjectivization. Like over time, we care much more about subjectivity and people's feelings. And I'm sure feminization is part of that story. I don't even think it's the whole story, but I think it's part of that story. But even psychology 100 years ago, right, was, I think, much closer to Stoicism. Philip Rieff, who was a scholar, and he wrote a lot on Freud. He wrote a book called Freud, Mind of the Moralist, and he described Freud as a Stoic moralist. He said that, Freud has a lot of wacky stuff, but he said at the end of the day, Freud is basically telling people to, in private, deal with their emotions, and that the goal is not happiness, right? Freud did not think the goal was happiness, and he was actually quite, in some sense, a bit like Joseph Conrad. He's a bit of a tragic thinker in the sense of he doesn't really believe in human perfectibility. He thinks humans are sort of at their best when they're wrestling with their issues, dealing with their challenges, almost more than overcoming them. And at that time, he and other people did not think the goal of therapy or of mental health was to be happy. They thought the goal was to, alleviate unnecessary suffering, sort of, get people unblocked in some sense from issues. And then over time, as it becomes sort of more public, you have these sort of public mental health things, and that mixes with spirituality, the self-help movement, and suddenly it's a panacea. Suddenly it's like everybody needs to be expressive and positive. And so, yeah, maybe part of it too is sort of a cultural change that now we're having a bit of a backlash to. I still think it's incredible that Jordan Peterson, right, is like the most probably popular psychologist of all time, right? And most of what he does is just tell people to take responsibility and like clean their room. And yet that message is somehow in this time period like the most popular message. It's crazy to, if you told somebody that 100 years ago, they'd think, you're nuts.
Thomas Saz's book on the history of psychoanalysis and therapy essentially has a similar story where he says the therapists are the inheritors of Greek philosophers and priests. They play a mixed role in the sense that, like the Stoics, Epicureans, and so on, they think about, how can you cure your thinking? How can you improve your thinking? In addition to, I think, inheriting some of these, if not religious, at least symbolic and ceremonial roles that might have been taken by a shaman or a priest in many different cultures. And it's certainly true that sometimes what people describe as medicine is a way to cover up what really is a kind of moral entrepreneurship and these deeper philosophical claims. So I think people like Peterson get a lot of play because he challenges what at least some people perceive to be those philosophical claims around lacking responsibility. Perhaps, there's always this political undercurrent, even if it's not explicit in Peterson, that speaks to people. And then, of course, he has the religious element as well.
And he, like the Stoics and the other Greek schools we talked about at the beginning, they're trying to integrate all of these things together, right? So they're trying to have your mental state is related to your physical state, is related to your political state, is related to your it's this more nested view of a good life of a person that I think a lot of people are missing right now. And this connects a little bit, I guess, to the sort of neoliberalism kind of individualism thesis. But there's a term, in psychology, psychosocial integration, which is the idea that the relationship between the individual and their family and their community and society at large is like a healthy one, right? Because in the same way, friends can have a healthy or unhealthy relationship, or family members, you can have an unhealthy or healthy relationship to your society, right? So if you feel a part of your society, you feel the society respects you, like that's a healthy relationship. Whereas if you feel oppressed or discriminated against, or you just don't even feel involved, right? That's not a healthy relationship. And there's, there's one psychologist who wrote a book called the Globalization of Addiction. And he basically argues this is sort of the unspoken issue of our time, is just people do not feel integrated. They don't feel like their personal, physical, community, family, social, political, like they don't feel like every layer is okay in a way that years ago they just would have taken for granted.
Yeah. I think that this is somewhat speculative, but it's always interesting to hear that from people whose role just sort of is plausibly the result of unbundling a community, where you have a third party now who parents can refer their children to, who schools can refer them to, and this third party is usually not as well integrated in the community as a priest or philosopher might have been in the past. So that's interesting. But I also do go back and forth on this question around like how much more do people take these challenges of meaning seriously today than they did in the past. In the past, people had dark nights of the soul, status anxiety, and I think that if you think about those people who were able to, live in their communities, were they that happy, or were they on some lower rung of the hierarchy of needs, where that this sort of thing just didn't concern themselves at all? I'm not so sure.
That's always a fascinating question, and it's a fascinating question across so many domains, right? Like how different were people in the past to today? And you have the historicist schools, and I don't know, presentist, is that the term, schools on these kinds of questions. It's really interesting, especially for politics too. But yeah, I think on happiness and morality and all these things, it's a huge question. I tend to take the view that people will find reasons to be unhappy. Basically, the standard of living that we have today is so much higher than it was even 100 years ago. And my guess is that probably in every time people can find reasons to be unhappy. And at the same time, I think there may be something unique about today's situation where it seems like some people are living the best lives ever, and a lot of people seem to have these lives where they're totally disconnected from everything. And that actually brings me to my last question I wanted to ask you, which is, okay, so we acknowledge that virtue is important for people in order to, feel fulfilled, be mentally healthy, less about happiness necessarily than just having a purpose, having a vision. There's a lot of, speculation about AI and a sort of post-industrial society where there's less work for people to do, things get automated away, and what are people going to do with their time, right? This is obviously speculative, but we can already sort of see with ChatGPT and these things, like there are some jobs that are being created, but a lot of work is, a lot of factory work has already been automated away, and soon you'll have more of this sort of technical, white collar work too. And people sort of sometimes wonder, okay, well, what is the world going to look like after that? And I think whether you're a utilitarian or more of a virtue ethicist really, I think, affects how you view that question, because a lot of my more utilitarian friends, they think, oh, well, everyone will just be happy. Like they'll be taking psychedelics. They'll be, having fun, playing video games. And I sort of think like those will be the zombie people. And there'll be a lot of other people who are trying to be a hero and they don't know how. And I just want to, ask you, what do you think? Do you think even in a world in which most problems were solved, there was little to fight about, would people be unhappy because they still deeply desire to be virtuous? And, how would they even show that?
Yeah. So I think that maybe this ties in with the previous question. I think that it's true that many of us have mutually incompatible desires. And that means that in a number of situations where we might be satisfied, in one desire, we're going to be, of course, frustrated in the other. And this might be another case of this where, yes, so there will be, if we enter some sort of abundant society of leisure, there will be a class of people who are able to have some, maybe completely euphoric, blissed out experiences and be happy with that, whether or not that is good for them. And then there'll be another set of people who know how to use that leisure well. But knowing how to use leisure well is not a easy problem at all. So there certainly will be challenges around that. Does it mean people will be happy? Well, they have the opportunity of happiness. Just bring it back to Stoicism. In whatever circumstance you are in, you can be happy. Does that mean it's easy to achieve? No, it's probably one of the hardest things in life to achieve. To be, build up that character of virtuous. Build up that character of virtue is always a matter of constant evolution. So that's maybe not that precise of an answer to the question, but are people going to be unhappy? No, they'll have the opportunity for happiness just as they do in every other age.
I mean, I think if you look at the current upper class, right, who has the ability to, most of them could just retire if they wanted to and live a life of luxury, and yet they seek out the most difficult challenges that they can. They work more than anybody else. And that's obviously very different than in the past, where in the past, the poorest people will be working the most and the rich people will be working the least. And now it's like reversed. And it just, I know I'm not a technology guy. I don't really know what the timeline is going to be like. A lot of my AI friends seem to think things are going to change very rapidly, very quickly in the near future. And I can almost imagine a world in which people are just, they're still thirsty for virtue. And I don't know, perhaps we come up with sort of other ways of establishing that. I don't know, new kinds of games, immersive reality things, maybe new status competitions, I guess is what I imagine. But I'm not convinced that people will be happy. Even I think just because I think no matter how contented they are, they're still going to be missing that feeling of wanting to do better, wanting to be the hero. Although, I mean, to be fair, I guess it's different for different people, right?
Yeah, it's different for different people. I mean, if I imagine that world sounds amazing. I can read as much as I want. I can, have interesting conversations with people. I don't need to, bother myself with all these, mundane physical tasks, boring logistics. That sounds fantastic.
But what if the intellectual work was also automated? So what if no matter how much you read, you would never be as smart as like the Siri on your phone, and people, it almost became inconsequential how much you knew because people wouldn't ask you about it. They would ask the Siri, right? What about that kind of automation?
Yeah, I think that doesn't bother me as much. I mean, to some extent, we're already in that world. So that may not bother me so much. But I think perhaps other people, their ways of learning or challenging themselves might be less oriented around sort of individual activity of learning, but are going to be more around, gaining status, reputation, dominating others, or not. And are those people going to be happy? Well, are they happy? Maybe they'll be about as happy as they are now. I'm not sure.
All right. Well, Caleb, if people want to find you or the Stoa app, where should they go?
Yeah, you can find me. I have a Substack, Caleb M. Ontiveros. You should be able to find that through Google. If you want to try the Stoa app, learn more about Stoicism, we have hundreds of hours of lessons and meditations there. Just search Stoa, STOA, in the Play Store or App Store.
Awesome. All right. Well, Caleb, it's been great talking to you. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Cool. Thanks so much.